Senator Markey. Senator Markey, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Yeah, we're in a period of enormously rapid change technologically, artificial intelligence, 5G, Zoom, all of it moving very, very rapidly. But thank goodness there's also new developments, in how to more efficiently use the spectrum which we have, and to improve upon our competitiveness. Mr. Lewis, would you take that question and just explain how this recent technological changes are making more spectrum available for our use?
Sure, Senator. And it's not just more, it's more efficient use of spectrum. We have a market now that looks very different, a spectrum market that looks very different than it did a couple decades ago or even a decade ago. We have updated, finer-tuned instruments. Many of the fights we've seen between agencies that have been referenced by senators, could be solved with early planning and early engagement, like Mr. Van has said, but also making sure that we're looking at certain standards for the equipment that's used. And this needs to be done on a collaborative basis. We need all stakeholders at the table, and it needs to be done early. And I think this is why looking to a longer-term auction authority can send the signal from Congress that that is needed and that we want to avoid those types of problems in the future.
Yeah, and unlicensed users are also important using the spectrum. They're disruptors. They're change agents, they're experimenters, and we have to make sure that we carve out the space for them in this spectrum world that we live in. I'd like to talk as well, if I could, about spectrum auctions, which do raise significant amount of money, less than in the past, but still a ton of revenues are made available. And just look over at a real need. During the pandemic, we saw that there were 12 to 17 million children who did not have the internet at home. And we were able, and I led the effort, to put in $7 billion for an emergency connectivity fund so that kids at home could have it. Now, that funding is starting to run out. So could you look at this issue for us, please, Mr. Lewis, and talk about whether or not some of these revenues should be dedicated to ensuring that we have a permanent emergency connectivity fund so that no child, especially Black, brown, immigrant children in our country, are left behind?
Sure, and thank you for championing the Emergency Connectivity Fund, Senator. I served on my local school board for 2 terms, and we lived that experience with students who were not connected in the home, and the homework gap is real with the disadvantages that they had with their peers. I think there's a number of sources of funding that could be used to continue the ECF. We've talked about the Airways for Equity idea, where auction revenue can be used and set aside for digital equity funds. That can include some of the educational needs from the ECF. Of course, Congress can always, because auctions don't come in a regular schedule, Congress could always appropriate more money to continue on that work, but certainly it's a critical part of making sure that everyone is connected and sees the benefits of high-speed, quality connectivity.
Yeah, we're going to have kids, 20 years from now, looking back at their childhood saying, and they just left me behind. I wasn't, connected, and that it harmed them. So I just think with the revenues that are raised, we just have to ensure that we focus on ensuring that everyone gets access to it. And that's what the Emergency Connectivity Fund is. And I just think that fund should get a part of any revenues. And finally, on net neutrality, everyone wants competition. They want to make sure that there's a Darwinian paranoia-inducing, competition environment. And that's what net neutrality is all about as well, Mr. Lewis. I introduced legislation a couple of days ago with Senator Wyden, and we have a couple of dozen of our colleagues who have signed on, talk about how important net neutrality is to ensuring that we have a marketplace, that allows every voice to be heard, every competitor to be able to compete.
Yes, Senator. Net neutrality is important to prevent harmful discrimination by the broadband providers that serve as gatekeepers to the internet. And for years now, we've had broadband providers committing to adhere to those principles, but we still have a number of examples over the years, while we have not had clear net neutrality rules, strong net neutrality rules, that should be looked at, that should be investigated by an expert agency like the FCC. And unfortunately, they don't have the authority to do so right now. So restoring those rules and that authority, I think, is essential.
I agree with you. I think net neutrality, it just means non-discrimination. That's just another way of saying it. And we just can't allow discrimination on the net. And that's the goal of net neutrality. And I'm going to continue with Senator Wyden and so many more of my colleagues in order to press for that to become the policy in our country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you.